So I've had a ton of requests for raised bed garden boxes, but I was hesitant about doing a video on this because they all look the same. So I decided that if I were going to build a set of these, I would have to put my twist to it and shake things up, and this is what I came up with. I was super pumped about how these turned out, and the best part of it is I was able to build this 3-piece system only using common 2-inch material and, you guessed it, fence pickets. So as usual, the first thing that we're going to be doing is cutting parts, but I'm going to be breaking this down into a couple of different builds. The 2 outside boxes for this build, they're the exact same, and you don't have to have 2. You could just build one and then the tall planter to match, or you could just build one or the other. So the first one's going to be for the long lower setting planter. Then I'll teach you how to build the tall middle planter. And the large majority of the material that we're going to be cutting will be 2x2 stock, or 1.5 by 1.5. And yes, you can build this just by buying 2x2s, but it's a lot cheaper if you make your own. Here's just a quick tip on selecting the lumber that you're going to be cutting your 2x2s out of. We tend to think, okay, we need a 1.5 by 1.5, so let's just go with a 2x4 because it's 3.5 inches wide. But the problem with 2x4s, especially nowadays, is because they are only 3.5 inches wide, they make them a lot more susceptible to bending and bowing and things like that. Plus, I can cut these out of a lot smaller trees or even branches. That's why a lot of your 2x4s that you'll find will be littered with knots all down the board. So if it's a project that I'm going to be needing a lot of 2x2s for, I like to go with the wider material. And the reason why I go with the larger boards is because they have to be cut out of larger sections of trees, which is going to mean fewer knots and things like that. So whenever you are selecting your lumber, look for things like this. Okay, we have as few knots as possible, nice tight grain, and the knots that are in there nice and tight. And of course you want to find the straightest boards as possible, but this is what you want to avoid. Okay, you see this knot? This is what I call a loose knot. I did not notice it while I was at the store, but luckily it's going to fall right in a place where I can cut it out. But other than that knot, this board is really clear and pretty straight. So with that little tidbit out of the way, let's get to sawing some wood.
Finish him!
So I'm about to teach you step by step on how I built this 3-piece system. But as always, if you're a plans in the hand type of person, head over to my website, and I'll also throw a link in the description. I wanted to show you this. This board is laid out exactly the way that it was cut. And that knot that I was telling you about, look what happened whenever I cut through it. Okay, so we're touching on both ends. So whenever I cut through this knot, it released the pressure and actually created a bow in this board. So again, just keep that in mind whenever you're picking out your lumber. So now with some 1.5 by 1.5 strips, we can start cutting these boards to length. So for the large planter frames, we'll need 4 parts that will be 30 inches long. These will be our legs. And then we'll need 6 parts that are 33 inches long. We'll use these as our front and back rails. We'll need 6 parts that are 19 inches long. These will be the side rails. Then we'll also rip a board down to 1 inch. And we'll need 4 parts that are 1 inch by 1.5 by 33 inches long. We'll be using these as supports later. And if you enjoy builds like this, let me know by supporting the channel and hitting that subscribe button. Alright, so now that we have all of our stock parts cut, let's go ahead and put the decorative ends on our legs. So we're going to be putting a 45-degree angle decorative cap on each one of these legs. So start off by marking the tops of each leg 3/4 of an inch down, and then you'll make that mark all the way around. Then on the edge of each side, mark 3/4 of an inch in. This will give us our cutting angle. So what you end up with should look something like this. Let me show you how to use these marks. So with your saw set to 45 degrees, after you make your first cut and rotate the board towards the fence, so all that you have to do is line the mark up on the outside edge with the blade and make your cut. So with our caps cut, let's go ahead and move on to our rails. We need to cut a 1/2 inch rabbet all the way down each one of our rails, both the 33 and the 19 inch, with the exception of 2 of the 19 inch. We're going to set those to the side. The rest of these, we'll go ahead and take them over to the table saw. So at the table saw, we are going to lower our blade to 1/2 of an inch. Then we'll move the fence in so that the outside tooth is set at 1/2 of an inch. If you just set the saw to 1/2 of an inch, the cut will end up being 1/2 an inch plus the width of your blade. And since some blade widths vary a bit, this is the most accurate way to set your saw. It will take 2 passes per board. This will create a 1/2 inch rabbet, or basically a ledge, that we will use later to install our 1/2 inch sideboards. So you'll make your first pass through the saw and then flip the board over so that it completes the cut. Now technically you do not have to cut this rabbet into the material, but then the sideboards will stick out further than our rails. By insetting the sideboards, it's going to give it a much cleaner look. Another way that you can do this is to run all of your boards through once and then bring them back to make the second cut. So with a rabbet's cut, let's go ahead and start assembling our front and back panels. So for the front and back panels, we're going to be needing 2 of our legs. We're going to be putting the points up. Then we'll need 3 of our 33 inch rails. But before we get our rails lined up, let's go ahead and pre-mark and pre-draw our legs. So we're going to start off by marking our side rail placement onto our legs. Our first one is going to be at 4 inches. Our second one will be at 16 1/4 of an inch. And then our third, 28 1/4. With these marks, it's going to make it a lot easier to line things up. So the side of the boards that we just made our marks on will actually be facing up whenever we go to assemble this. But before we can assemble, we need to pre-drill and counterbore our legs. So the easiest way to do this is with the markings on the legs facing up. Let's turn those markings in towards each other. And this will actually have the two outside edges facing up. Now let's mark our screw placement. So to mark our screw placement, we'll measure up 4 1/2 inches, 16 3/4 of an inch, and 27 3/4 of an inch. And then from the outside edge, we'll measure in 1/2 of an inch at each one of those marks. We'll be drilling where the two lines intersect. Again, there's a couple of different ways that you can attach these. I'll just be using screws and then caps to cover those later. So with my screw placement marked, I'm going to be using Craig's counterbore bit. If you're using Craig's counterbore, it will automatically stop at 3/8 of an inch deep. Now this drill bit will not be long enough to go through this board, but I'll use that hoe as a guide for a longer drill bit whenever I connect my legs to my rails. So now our sides look like this, and then if we turn to where our face is up, now we're ready to start assembling. So the easiest way to install these screws is going to be to bring the legs as close to the edge of your work surface as possible. That way the drill has plenty of room and the screws don't go in crooked. I'm also going to be clamping down a straight edge to push against. This will just help to keep our parts from moving. So now that I'm at the edge of my workstation, I have direct access to these screw holes. So now let's go ahead and line our rails up with the marks that we made on the top. So each one of these rails will have a side that's a full 1 1/2 inch, and the other side where we cut the notch or the rabbet will only be 1 inch. So our top two rails will actually have the rabbets facing each other. That way we can set our panels in when we're ready. And then the bottom rail will be facing the same direction as the middle. So to line these up with the marks that we have on our legs, starting at the bottom, we'll line the bottom edge up with our mark, then the middle, the bottom edge up with our mark, and then the top will actually be lining our top edge up with the mark. So basically all of the 1 1/2 inch sides. So now that we have our outside leg and our rails in line, let's go ahead and finish that pre-drill using a longer bit. This will help to prevent the rail itself from splitting. So now that that is pre-drilled, let's go ahead and put some wood glue on the inside and install our screws. So now with the left side done, let's go ahead and flip all of our parts around and do that again for the right hand side. So now we have one panel done. Let's go ahead and make our second panel. And the second panel will be made the exact same way as we made our first. So now that we have the front and back panels made, we have one more thing left to do before we can install our side rails. So with the panels flat on the table and the rabbets facing down, we're going to pre-drill and counterbore our screw holes to attach these side rails. So the screw placement for the side rails will be a little bit different, just to keep the screws from hitting each other inside of our legs. From the bottom, we're going to measure up 4 3/4, 17 inches, and 27 1/2 inches. And then from each side, we'll measure in 3/4 of an inch to the center of our board. And if you were going to make very many of these, I would just use some of the thin material that came off of the sides and make a template for all of this screw placement. And then just like we did before, we'll pre-drill and counterbore each one of these marks. And this is what it should look like. So now that we have that done, let's attach these to our side rails. So I'm going to stick one in the back, just for spacing and alignment. And if you remember at the beginning how one of our side rails did not have a rabbet, well, that's where this one comes into play. It's actually going to be placed on the bottom. It'll still line up with our bottom rail, but since this part will actually be a shelf, we do not need this to be inset. And for the alignment of these side rails, you can use the same measurements of the front and back panels if you'd like, or you can just line them up. And then we'll just keep repeating these steps all the way around. What are you laughing about? And if you're going to be applying stain to any of these, just make sure to clean up any glue squeeze out. So now we'll just need to install some support slats on the bottom, and then you're ready to paint or stain or whatever you would like. Let's go and get that knocked out. This is where we'll be using the 1 inch by 1.5 by 33 inch long material. One of the boards we'll be placing in the very center of the bottom just to help to support that bottom shelf. And the other 3 boards, we'll be attaching these to our middle rails, and these will be to support the material that we're going to put down for the floor. And since this section of the build is what's going to be holding the weight of the soil, I decided to beef it up a little bit and add 3 across. But before we get these installed, I'm going to put a couple of pocket holes in each end. If you decide to install these with pocket holes, just set the depth collar on your bit to 1 inch. It's really up to you on whether you install these with the pocket holes facing up or down, because essentially they're all going to be covered in the end. But I decided to install mine facing down. So we want to install these supports flush with the bottom of our side rails. So I'll start by installing a center support on our bottom rail, which will end up being our shelf. And for this, I'll be centering the board at 9.5 inches. And then to attach the support to the side rails, I'm going to be using wood glue and 1.5 inch blue coat screws. And for those of you that are not familiar with blue coat, it's Craig's coated exterior screws. Now let's go ahead and install the 3 center supports. And to make sure that these are installed flush, I'll be using a piece of scrap wood and actually insetting that into our notch like this. Then I'll just clamp this into place. That way whenever I go to install my supports, everything lines up perfectly. Let me show you what I'm talking about. And for the spacing of the 3 center boards, we'll put a board flush with each outside rail and then one in the very center. Now with all of our supports installed, there's only one thing left to do before we stain or paint this. And that's going to be to fill in all of our counterboards and cover our screws. And you can do this a couple of different ways. They actually sell these little buttons, kind of rounded over on the end. They're already milled down to 3/8 of an inch. Put a little wood glue on the end, and I actually just kind of tap those in with a hammer. Probably the easiest way, and these things are pretty cheap. And then another way to do this, and what I'm actually going to be doing, is just get some 3/8 dowel rod. If you're going to be painting this, it really doesn't matter. If you're going to be staining this, you'll probably want the same species, unless you want that kind of a mixed species look. But if you're using a dowel rod, just put a little wood glue on the ends, then line it up with your holes. Give it a little twist in or a little tap on the end with a hammer. And then you can use a flush cut saw or a pull saw to cut it flush. And then you'll just repeat this for all of the screws. There's actually a really neat trick that I've seen Brad with Fix This Build That do while you're using a flush cut saw. Essentially, you drill a 3/8 of an inch hole through the playing card and then just slide it over your dowel before you make your cut. I'd definitely be using that trick if I weren't planning on painting this as soon as I was done. And then once all of your dowels are installed, go ahead and sand those flush, and while you're at it, go ahead and hit the entire frame. So once you have everything painted up the way that you would like, I chose black for this one because I'm really liking this black trim with the cedar. Plus it's a really hot style right now, and you can pretty much sell anything that's painted up that way. So for the sidewalls and all of the floors, I'm going to be using cedar fence pickets. And this step's probably going to be easier if this thing is on its side. And this is where those notches that we cut at the very beginning are actually going to come into play. We'll be cutting all of our sidewalls to 10 inches in length, then they'll just snap right into that notch or the rabbet that we cut earlier. Let's get some more of these cut and get this baby put together. I'll be placing wood glue in each one of the notches, then I'll be using 1-inch brad nails to fasten these down. Air compressor. We turned it off because it kicked on. Now I have no air for my nails. I'm also going to be leaving a 1/16 of an inch gap on each one of my sides. Since this will be outside and will be shrinking and swelling with the seasons, I don't want the material to swell to the point that it buckles. You can really use anything that you want as a spacer for this. I'm using a 1/16 of an inch shelf bracket, but even scraps of wood will work. And the size of the gap is completely up to you. When it's all said and done, we're going to have a liner on the inside of this, so it really doesn't matter. I'll be placing wood glue in each one of the notches, then I'll be using 1-inch brad nails to fasten these down. So for all of the panels, our boards will be 10 inches long. For the front and back panels, we'll need 5 boards that are 5.5 inches wide, or your standard size fence picket width, and then 1 board that is 5-inch wide. And then for each end, you'll need 3 boards that are 5.5 inches wide, and 1 board that is 2 inches wide. Again, you'll need that for both ends. So with all of our sides installed, now it's time to install our bottoms. So we'll need a bottom to sit on top of the supports that we put in here, as well as our bottom shelf. For putting in the inside bottom, it's probably going to be a lot easier if I do it on its side. So using the same fence picket material, the bottom slats will be 19 inches long. We'll need 5 of these that are 5.5 inches wide, and 1 on the end that's 5 inches wide. So now that we have the bottom of this box installed, now let's go ahead and install the slats for our bottom shelf. We're needing 5 slats that are 5.5 inches wide by 20 inches long, and then 1 end slat that's 5 inches wide. So for the bottom shelf, there's a couple of different ways that you can install these. Typically, don't like to use brad nails any place that they'll be showing. But for this, I think that it won't be noticeable on the bottom. Or if you would like to install these with small screws, you can do that as well. Just make sure to pre-drill and counterbore each one. Okay, so now that we have this one done, well, pretty much done, we still need to put a liner in it, and maybe a clear coat or sealant of some kind. But if you'd like one on each side, then you just make another one just like it. So let me go ahead and teach you how to make the taller one for the middle. So this one's going to go a lot quicker because it's pretty much all the same parts, all the same steps. It's just different length material. Let me show you. Okay, so now that you know how to build the side planters, let me show you how to build the taller recessed planter that goes into the middle. So for the tall planter, as mentioned before, really the only difference is going to be in our length. We will be needing 4 legs that are 1.5 inches by 1.5 inches by 36 inches long. We'll be needing 6 side rails that are 1.5 inches by 1.5 inches by 13 inches long. And then we'll be needing 3 supports that are 1 inch by 1.5 inches by 17 inches long. And just like for the side planters, we'll be needing to cut 1/2 inch rabbets in all of our rails except for 2 of the short side rails. So now that we have our notches cut, let's go ahead and put our caps onto our legs. And again, we're going to be doing this the exact same way as before. And like before, we're going to start off by assembling the front and back of our frames. Since these legs are taller, the screw placement's going to be a little bit different for this. There's still going to be 1/2 inch in on each outer side, and then pre-drill and counterbore at each mark. And those measurements will be at 4 3/4, 23 inches, and 33 1/4 inch. And then we'll rotate the boards outwards and then place our marks to line our rails up with. The bottom of the center rail will measure 22 inches up, and the top of the top rail will be 34 inches up. And if you're wondering why my measurement for the top rail wasn't from the bottom like the previous two, is because that mark would fall where the notch is for the top rail. So it's just a lot easier to line it up with the top. And just like before, we'll pre-drill, add wood glue, and attach the rails to the legs with screws. Then we'll repeat this for the opposite side, and then the front panel is done. And then we'll repeat these steps for the back panel. So with the notches facing down, we'll measure and counterbore the center of each one of these legs at 4 3/4 inch, 22 3/4 inch, and 33 1/4 inch. And here's a tip for counterboring. Always make sure that your drill bit is nice and tight so you don't end up like this. Yeah, it's not supposed to be there. Back to work. Oh, I really did it this time. So instead of flipping this around so it would be closer to me and I could actually center this thing properly, I got in a hurry, thought that I would take the shortcut, reach over to counterbore, and I guess I started drilling at an angle, put too much pressure on my bit, and snapped it off. And the lovely thing is, here's the other side, because I got in a hurry. Now it's going to take me twice as long because I have to get this thing out. So learn from my mistake, guys. It never pays to get in a hurry. Aha! Should have been a dentist. And the second half, back to work again. Already did that side. And then you'll repeat this center counterbore for both of your parts, all except for, breaking off the screws. Now it's time to attach the side rails. Oh, wrong one. And do not forget, like I did, that the side rails that do not have a notch, they go on the bottom. Okay, so now with the frame put together, the only thing left to do is put in my support slats. And this time I'm only connecting the support slats to my center rails. But I really don't think that the bottom shelf needs that extra support board, but if you'd like to throw it in there, throw it in. Main reason I'm making sure to put these in the middle, this is the part of the structure that's going to be holding the weight of the soil. So let's go ahead and throw those in, and then I can get this thing painted and install my walls. So just like for the first one, I've installed pocket holes in the ends of each one of these supports. I'll be placing one flush with each rail and then one in the very center. So now that our support slats are in, the only thing left to do before we paint or stain this thing is going to be to add our plugs in all of our counterbore holes. Let's get that done and get this painted. Now that the paint's dry, The only thing left to do is put in our bottoms and our sides just like we did for the other one. And again, for this one, I'll be using cedar pickets because I'm going to leave those natural. If you're going to be painting the sides as well, you could really use any type of material that you like pine pickets or even pallet wood. But since my material is 5.5 inches wide, for the bottom shelf, I'll be needing 3 boards that are 14 inches long. Then I'll be putting in all of my sides. The front and back will take 3 boards each that are 10 inches long. Then each side will take 2 full boards that are 10 inches long, and then 1 board that's 1 3/4 inch wide. And since all my material is 5.5 inches, for the spacing on the front and the back, I'm going to leave just a little wider of a gap. And if you want all of your spacing to match perfectly, you can rip down a thin board. But again, all of this is going to be getting a liner, so really, I'm not too worried about it. And then for the floor on the top, if you'd like to line that, you'll be needing 3 boards that are 13 inches long. And that's all there is to this tall planter. Turned out pretty cool. Wait till you see them all together. Like I mentioned earlier, there's different ways that you can mix and match these. You can have 2 tall ones and 1 short one, really anything that you'd like. And if you wanted to fasten these together, you could do that from the back or even run a screw through the legs. But any way that you decide to lay these out, they're going to look pretty cool. And there you have it. This is 2-inch construction grade material, so you can do this out of 2x4s, 2x6s, 2x whatever, and fence pickets. The only thing left to do, and again, this is optional, would be to line these with felt. And I would just get garden felt, center it in, fasten it around the edges, and then just cut off the excess. But regardless of how you decide to lay this project out, or this project at all, this is proof that all you need is to believe in yourself and have a bit of creativity, and you can accomplish anything. So the time for any excuses that you have told yourself is up. So get up, get out, and go create something. Till next time, guys, we'll see ya.